Cartel bosses are notorious for using brutal execution methods on those who cross them, and these acts have only fueled their terrifying reputation.
They have fed some of their victims, dead and alive, to tigers.
Mayo, one of the most powerful figures in the Sinaloa cartel, has recently made headlines with a new execution video that's got everyone talking. The content of this video is causing a stir online. If you're curious about why this execution is considered so shocking, stick around until the end to see for yourself. The death sentence. Just imagine, one moment you're running your empire, thinking you're untouchable, and the next you're tied up, thrown in a boat, and then dumped right into the river. It sounds like something straight out of a movie, but it did happen in real life. A Venezuelan drug lord known as Taliban found out the hard way what happens when you cross a cartel. After stealing 450 pounds of cocaine and cash, he ended up in the ocean, hands zip-tied, with an anchor around his waist. Can you imagine the terror? This wasn't just a warning, it was the end of the line for Ronaldo Fuentes. At 68, Fuentes thought he was clever. He dumped a $10 million shipment of drugs at sea, then spun a tale about being chased by the Coast Guard to cover his tracks, but maybe he got a little too confident. He went back to collect the drugs, repackaged them, and smuggled them to another Caribbean island. Smart, right? Well, not smart enough. Fuentes had been living under a fake name in the Dominican Republic, thinking he was safe. He even earned the nickname Taliban for his shady deals with Middle Eastern traffickers. But what if he'd stayed hidden a little longer? Maybe things would have been different. On July 17th, Fuentes left his Dominican home, lured into what he thought was a cartel meeting, but instead, he was kidnapped and taken out to sea. In a chilling video, you can see his killers struggling to lift him over the side of the boat. After this, they dumped him into the Caribbean, leaving him to drown. It's a harsh reminder that in the world of cartels, betrayal isn't just punished, it's eliminated. That's how the mafia runs its business. Virtually any mafia. They'll do anything to instill fear in their own people and in their enemies. It's not just a one-off thing either. Even for El Mayo's cartel, the Sinaloa cartel, it's the same deal. They rule with an iron fist, making sure that everyone knows the consequences of betrayal. Maybe it's their way of keeping everyone in line. If you're in that world, you can't afford to slip up, not even once. Back in July 2011, Mexico collectively held its breath as a horrifying video made its way around. A cartel hit featuring Felix Gomez Garcia and his uncle Barnabas getting dismembered by a chainsaw. Now, cartels have a reputation for extreme violence, but this was something else. And that got me thinking, have you ever wondered about the most brutal execution methods cartels use? Let's talk about some of the grimmest, starting with something they call El Guiso, or the stew. Meet Santiago Mesa Lopez, one of Mexico's most notorious criminals, known far and wide as El Pozolero, which loosely translates to the stew maker. You see, Santiago was no ordinary guy. He had a particularly grim talent for making people disappear. Literally, he's believed to have dissolved over 300 bodies in acid at his ranch in Ensenada, about 70 miles from the US border. This gruesome execution method is like making a stew, but instead of food, it's, well, something a lot more sinister. Imagine a giant barrel filled with boiling water and concentrated sulfuric acid, bubbling and spitting dangerously hot liquid. Once it's all heated up, the victims, yes, they're still breathing, are dunked into the barrel, and what follows is nothing short of a living nightmare. It's an excruciatingly slow death, and the sadistic efficiency of it made it a go-to method for getting rid of enemies and traitors. Santiago's story is one that starts in poverty in Sinaloa, Mexico. Born in mid-April 1964, he was working construction by the time he was just 13. Fast forward to the 90s, and he moved to Tijuana, hoping to find a better life. But life had other plans. After his sister was raped by a criminal organization, Santiago sought revenge and found himself working for the Tijuana cartel, thanks to a childhood friend. His career took a dark turn when he was tasked with disposing of bodies, and soon he became a master of this deadly craft. He had a special technique. He dissolved the bodies in a tub filled with acid and sodium hydroxide, stirring the mix on high heat for at least 8 hours until the bodies were completely liquefied. Of course, some parts, like teeth and nails, didn't dissolve so easily. Those, Santiago would toss into a wasteland, burn again with gasoline, and bury. It's believed that he got rid of over 300 bodies this way. Authorities found about 14,000 remains at his ranch after his arrest. So you can see why they called it El Guiso. It's all about cooking, just not in any way you'd want to imagine. During his interrogation, Santiago claimed he tried to escape his boss, Efrain Perez, an ex-member of the Arellano Felix cartel, but every attempt failed. He said he was forced into the job after being recruited while working on a farm in 1996. The cartel made him carry out an experiment with water and acid in a barrel, and he didn't really have a choice, either comply or face violence himself. True or not, we may never know, but what we we do know is that he kept this gruesome practice going for years until the law finally caught up with him. Originally, Santiago was sentenced to just 10 years and was due for release in April 2022, which, as you can imagine, didn't sit well with the families of his victims. But in February 2024, his sentence was extended by an additional 30 years, ensuring he won't be getting out anytime soon. And so, the El Guizo method remains a brutal reminder of just how far cartel leaders will go to maintain control and strike fear into the hearts of their rivals. Now let's switch gears a bit and talk about something equally twisted: feeding victims to pets. Yes, you heard that right. Cartel bosses aren't just content with traditional forms of torture. They've got a liking for the dramatic, and nothing says, "I'm rich and dangerous," like keeping a few exotic pets around. We're talking tigers, lions, and other rare animals that you'd normally see in a zoo. But in the world of cartels, these creatures serve a much darker purpose. Since the 80s, exotic pets have been a status symbol among the cartel elite, following in the footsteps of infamous Colombian drug lords like Pablo Escobar. Some cartel bosses would throw their victims into enclosures with these starving predators, letting the animals do the dirty work. It was all about sending a message: if you cross us, you won't just die. You'll die in the most terrifying way possible. One cartel boss who was particularly fond of this method was Heriberto Lascano, aka Z3, or El Lasca. Born into poverty on Christmas Day in 1974, Lascano joined the military at 17 and later deserted to join the notorious Los Zetas cartel. He quickly gained a reputation for his brutality, using a method called La Paleta, where victims were stripped naked and beaten with a board. But that wasn't enough for Lascano. He also kept lions and tigers on his ranch, and he loved feeding his enemies to them. He didn't starve the animals, but he kept them hungry enough that when he tossed a victim into their cage, they were ready to devour them. And Lascano? He'd watch the whole thing, laughing at the scene. Sadly, Lascano never got a taste of his own medicine. Instead, he was killed in a shootout with Mexican military officials. Finally, there's the gruesome practice of flaying. In 2018, a video surfaced online that shocked Mexico to its core. It showed a father and son being tortured and murdered by cartel members. The two men were tied up, gagged, and made to kneel on the ground. The captors started by beating the father with a wooden stick before beheading him with a small knife. And as if that wasn't horrific enough, the son had to watch his father die before enduring his own brutal fate. The captors flayed his chest with knives, keeping him conscious through the unimaginable pain. One of the most infamous cases of flaying involved El Chapo, who flayed a rival cartel member, Hugo Hernandez, with a chainsaw and then ordered his soldiers to stitch the skin onto a ball as a warning to others. Hernandez's remains were left on the streets of Las Mocas. While brutal execution is one of the greatest worries when you join a cartel, there are other things you should also be concerned about. One of them is sheer violence. Have you ever witnessed a riot or a violent retaliation carried out by cartel members? Let's talk about why it's never something you'd want to witness. Wrath of the cartel. The cartel's operation is massive, and that's why most of its members will do anything to keep it running and out of the authorities' reach. For instance, Mexican drug lord Joaquin El Chapo Guzman wasn't just any ordinary criminal. He had an entire fleet at his disposal. We're talking Boeing 747 jets, speedboats, submarines, amphibious vessels, tractor-trailers, and even freight trains. He used all of these to move tons of illegal drugs from South America to Mexico, and then straight into major U.S. cities. And this wasn't just speculation. There's a secret testimony filed in U.S. District Court in Chicago that spilled the beans. Now, this testimony was from twin brothers Margarito and Pedro Flores, who were deeply involved in the drug trade themselves. They provided a first-hand glimpse into El Chapo's incredibly sophisticated logistics network. And you know what? His operation was like clockwork, with strict rules that everyone had to follow. El Chapo didn't mess around. Before he was finally captured after a 13-year game of hide-and-seek with law enforcement, Guzman managed to stay ahead of the game by greasing the palms of plenty of corrupt officials. It's no wonder he managed to keep the Sinaloa cartel, a multi-billion-dollar empire, thriving even while on the run. According to the 20-page testimony from the Flores brothers, El Chapo had multiple 747s, but not for regular passengers. No, these planes had their seats removed to make room for cocaine, up to 13 tons at a time. The planes would land in Central America, loaded with humanitarian aid for cover, but once the aid was offloaded, the real cargo, cocaine, was packed in, and off the planes went, headed back to Mexico. And where did these planes land? Mexico City's International Airport, of course. and with the help of corrupt authorities, the cocaine was swiftly unloaded and taken to its next stop. The Flores brothers were key players in this case. Their cooperation with prosecutors led to charges against 13 defendants, including Guzman himself. Their testimony also shed light on the role of Alfredo Vasquez Hernandez, a close friend of El Chapo, who was heavily involved in logistics. He was sentenced to 22 years in prison. The brothers also admitted to using Chicago as a hub for distributing El Chapo's drugs to 30 customers in cities like New York, Washington, D.C., and Los Angeles. At their peak, they were moving up to 2 tons of cocaine a month, just in Chicago. Vasquez Hernandez didn't just help with moving the cocaine, he was also involved in the logistics of moving the money. Payments were made to El Chapo and his sources of supply, all handled by Vasquez Hernandez, who also had his hands in the transportation of bulk cash. Mexico is dealing with a severe crisis of kidnappings, disappearances, and violent crime, with over 30,000 deaths reported each year since 2018. This violence is largely driven by gangs and drug cartels, but the state has also been involved in human rights abuses in its fight against these groups. As a result, civilians are bearing the brunt of this violence, pushing many to migrate towards the U.S. border. At the same time, drugs from these cartels continue to flow into the United States, fueling the ongoing drug overdose crisis. Back in the 1980s, Mexico's criminal organizations began to take shape, organizing themselves into distinct regions and creating complex trafficking routes. But as production and distribution ramped up, these groups started battling for control and access to markets, leading to a spike in violence across the country. The Mexican government declared war on these criminal organizations in 2006, when then-President Felipe Calderón launched a military crackdown. In 2012, President Enrique Peña Nieto shifted the approach away from violent confrontations and focused on improving law enforcement and public safety. However, things took a turn after the arrest of Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, the infamous leader of the Sinaloa cartel. After his arrest in 2014, rearrest in 2016, and eventual extradition to the U.S. in 2017, a power vacuum emerged within the Sinaloa cartel. This led to even more violence as rival factions fought for control. Even though Peña Nieto's reforms initially reduced homicides, violence surged again, peaking at 33,341 murders in 2018. The situation continued to be dire, with journalists being killed at an alarming rate and mass graves being discovered. Recognizing the failure of military tactics to reduce violence and amid accusations of human rights abuses, then presidential candidate Andrés Manuel López Obrador, or AMLO, promised a new approach. His Hugs Not Bullets policy aimed to tackle crime with poverty reduction programs, marijuana legalization, and new sentencing guidelines. After winning the election in December 2018, AMLO created a national guard to fight cartels. However, despite these efforts, violence persists, with over 30,000 crime-related deaths reported each year. The 2024 general elections were among the most violent in decades. Attacks on journalists remain high, and anti-corruption measures have stalled. Criminal organizations and drug traffickers continue to challenge the Mexican government's strength and legitimacy, affecting both Mexico and the United States. The Mérida Initiative, launched in 2007 to boost U.S.-Mexico cooperation on security, was replaced by the Bicentennial Framework in 2021 after AMLO rejected the earlier agreement. Meanwhile, cartels have expanded their influence, battling with heavy weaponry and drones. Kidnappings, killings, and attacks on journalists are ongoing, and justice for past crimes, especially those involving the military, remains almost impossible to prevent. After the kidnapping of 4 Americans in March 2023, some U.S. lawmakers even proposed sending a military force to Mexico. As of May 2024, it's estimated that cartels control about 1/3 of Mexico's territory. The Sinaloa and Jalisco cartels are major players in drug trafficking, responsible for supplying methamphetamines, cocaine, heroin, marijuana, and, notably, fentanyl, which is a leading cause of drug overdoses in the U.S. This ongoing situation continues to have serious implications for both nations. If the cartels are as powerful as this, then how did El Mayo get arrested? How did the authorities manage to catch him? And why didn't his cartel's sinister tactics, which had protected him for many years, save him this time? Betrayed. One of the world's top drug lords, Ismael Zambada, known as El Mayo, and the leader of Mexico's Sinaloa cartel, was arrested by U.S. federal agents in El Paso, Texas, on July 25, 2024. Zambada originally set up the criminal organization with Joaquín Guzmán, better known as El Chapo. Along with Zambada, federal agents also took into custody Guzmán's son, Joaquín Guzmán López. Earlier this year, Zambada faced charges from U.S. prosecutors related to a conspiracy involving fentanyl. According to reports from the Wall Street Journal, Zambada Zambada was lured onto a plane under false pretenses by a high-ranking Sinaloa member. He thought he was going to check out some secret airstrips in southern Mexico, but instead, he was flown to a private airstrip near El Paso, Texas. When the plane landed, Lopez was also taken into custody. Mexico's Security Minister Rosa Rodriguez confirmed that while her government was informed about the arrest of Zambada and Lopez by the U.S., Mexican authorities were not involved in the operation. Mexico's president has demanded full transparency from the U.S. about the capture, insisting on a detailed report rather than just general updates. U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland stated that the two men lead one of the most violent and influential drug trafficking organizations worldwide, and according to American prosecutors, the Sinaloa cartel is the largest drug supplier to the U.S. There are reports suggesting that El Mayo may have been betrayed by his own people. It was reported that Zambada was tricked onto the private plane by Joaquin, El Chapo's son. Joaquin Guzman Lopez, born on July 16, 1986, and also known as El Güero Moreno, is a key player in the Sinaloa cartel, a major drug trafficking group based in Culiacan. He's part of a powerful family faction called Los Chapitos, which includes his brothers Ovidio Guzman Lopez, Ivan Archivaldo Guzman Salazar, and Jesus Alfredo Guzman Salazar. After his recent arrest alongside El Mayo, Guzman Lopez faced charges, including one that could carry the death penalty. However, since he was arrested in the U.S., the extradition treaty between Mexico and the U.S. prevents him from being sentenced to death. On July 30th, he pleaded not guilty to the charges against him. This isn't the first time in history that a cartel boss has been betrayed by the people he trusted. Let's take a look at some of them, beginning with the Cali cocaine cartel. The end of the infamous Cali cartel came in 2006 in Miami, and it wasn't with a dramatic showdown, but with the simple rap of a judge's gavel. Miguel Rodriguez Orejuela and his brother Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela, both key figures in the cartel, admitted their guilt and were sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. But their downfall was more than just legal retribution. It was a tale of high-risk deception and betrayal. A surprising twist came from within the cartel itself. The cartel's head of security, a senior official who had once been loyal to the Orejuela brothers, decided to flip. After years of safeguarding the cartel's leaders and their families, he turned against them. It was incredibly risky for him, and he felt trapped in a corrupt environment. He had no choice but to escape. Federal prosecutor Edward Ryan called it a deeply personal betrayal to the Cali cartel, and the former cartel insider has remained a marked man. He's still considered a top target. Once known as Jorge Salcedo, this man had an unexpected background. With degrees in mechanical engineering and industrial economics, he initially designed forklifts and machinery. His father was a retired Colombian Army general, and Salcedo had a stint in the Army Reserves, but his heart lay more in engineering than in military life. His skills in electronic surveillance made him a prime candidate for counterterrorism. In the late 1980s, amidst Colombia's bloody conflicts involving guerrilla groups and rival cartels, Salcedo was dispatched to Europe to organize a paramilitary operation against a guerrilla stronghold, but the mission was canceled. However, his involvement caught the attention of the Cali cartel, who were locked in a bitter fight with Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel. Salcedo was brought into the cartel in 1989, a move he couldn't refuse. The Cali cartel, led by the Orejuela brothers, wanted Escobar dead. Despite several failed attempts, Salcedo was tasked with devising an assault on Escobar's compound, but those plans faltered as well. As Salcedo continued to strengthen the security for the cartel, he witnessed the gruesome side of cartel life, including the brutal execution of suspected traitors. This experience pushed him to consider defecting. He reached out to the DEA, but was initially dismissed as a crackpot. Eventually, Salcedo made a deal with U.S. authorities, feeding them important information that led to a series of successful raids. Salcedo played a big part in exposing the cartel's operations, leading to several indictments and the eventual extradition of the Orejuela brothers. Although the Orejuela brothers were unable to be extradited immediately due to a no extradition clause, they were eventually transferred to U.S. federal custody. Salcedo, now living under a new identity, received around $1.7 million for his cooperation. Despite this, he remains in hiding, with his whereabouts kept secret even from his own lawyer. Sometimes betrayal isn't just about turning in cartel bosses to the authorities. It can also involve a more direct form of treachery, like killing them. This was exactly what happened in the case of Michelle Navarra. Michelle Navarra, born on on January 5, 1905, was quite the character in the Sicilian mafia world. Dubbed Our Father, Navarra led the powerful Corleone family in Sicily. He wasn't just a crime boss, he was also a trained physician, adding a touch of respectability to his underworld dealings. Navarra had a rocky relationship with his subordinate, Luciano Leggio. Leggio was making a name for himself with various rackets, including transporting stolen cattle and selling the meat in Palermo. Tensions between the two escalated, especially over a major project, the damming of the Belice River near Corleone. Navarra opposed the dam, representing those who controlled the local water supply and saw it as a threat. On the flip side, Leggio saw the dam as a chance to corner the market on the related haulage work. In June 1958, Navarra attempted to take Leggio out. He lured Leggio to a meeting, but it was a trap with 15 armed men waiting. Leggio managed to escape with just minor injuries, and it was clear he had to act quickly or face certain death. The conflict came to a head on August 2, 1958, when Navarra and an innocent doctor who was not involved in criminal activities, Dr. Giovanni Russo, were ambushed and shot on a lonely country road while driving in Navarra's Fiat 1100. Two vehicles blocked their path, and the car was sprayed with bullets from submachine guns. Navarra's funeral was held in San Martino, Corleone's main church, just 2 days later. The violence didn't end there. A few weeks after Navarra's death, on September 6th, 3 of his friends were killed in a raid. The cycle of revenge continued until 1963, with Leggio eventually disappearing after being convicted of Navarra's murder. So if you're thinking about the darker side of power struggles, this story gives you a real taste of how treacherous things can get. And if you're wondering what happened to Leggio, he didn't exactly fade quietly into the background after Navarra's murder. He went on to become the boss of the Corleone family, leading one of the most ruthless factions of the Sicilian mafia. Leggio's reign was known for its violent incidents and power struggles, but the law eventually caught up with him. In 1974, he was arrested and convicted for multiple crimes and was sentenced to life in prison. Even behind bars, Leggio continued to pull strings within the mafia, maintaining his influence from his cell. However, his health began to decline over the years. On November 16, 1993, Luciano Leggio died of a heart attack in prison. Despite his notorious life, it was a natural death that finally ended his reign. Maybe it's a bit ironic, considering the bloody path he took to get there. If you enjoyed watching this video, click on any of the cards on your screen to watch more interesting contents.